Because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm Alex Epstein. Okay, interesting show today. I have an interview on the topic of California's energy nightmare, and then I'm going to answer two questions from listeners/viewers. So let's jump right into the interview. On today's show, I'm interviewing Ron Stein. Ron is an energy commentator who has a pretty extensive background in the energy industry. And I'm now recording this after the interview. I found out in the interview that actually the moral case for fossil fuels inspired him to start sharing his knowledge of energy with the world, which is pretty cool. He's the founder of PTS Advance, which is a successful energy staffing company. And he's the author of two books. One is called Energy Made Easy, and the other is called Just Green Electricity. The reason I brought him on in particular is I've been reading some of his columns, and he makes a lot of points that there's a lot of overlap between the points that he makes and the points that I make. But he has had a lot of columns in particular on the energy situation in California, where I live and where he lives. And this is something where I'm not an expert at all on California energy in particular. I know more about it than most, but I was eager to pick his brain. And so I think we covered a lot of interesting topics. So I hope you enjoy that. And then after that, I will take two questions from listeners. All right. Coming up, Ron Stein on California's energy nightmare. I'm joined now by Ron Stein to talk about California energy policy. Ron, welcome to Power Hour.
Glad to be aboard.
So, Ron, I know you've worked for decades in the energy industry, but how did you become so interested in energy policy, and particularly California policy, which you know a lot about?
Well, I began my career working at an international engineering and construction firm, designing and building infrastructures around the world, and had the opportunity to be involved in several refinery projects, some internationally and some in California, and learned a lot about the intricacies of that energy industry. And then in 1995, I had the opportunity to start a staffing firm that was focused on providing staffing augmentation to that energy industry. And having a complete understanding of the industry, the terminology, the duties, the responsibilities of the various job positions and the key players in the industry, that was a catalyst for the company to grow and prosper. And to the point now that PTS Advance is now one of the largest staffing firms in Orange County. And then after reading your book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, it was an aha moment when I realized that folks had very little energy literacy to fully comprehend what the industry was done for developing societies, economies, and lifestyles. And that began my passion and focus on authoring numerous op-ed articles and two books that attempt to provide, in layman's terms, an explanation of the great things that fossil fuels have done and are doing for societies and economies worldwide.
Wow. So I didn't know this, actually. I didn't bring you on knowing this fact that you got interested in advocacy from my book. I mean, we met many years ago. So prior to that, you weren't doing much publicly talking about these things, writing about these things?
None at all. You started it all.
So I'm just curious, what specifically was it just that you realized, wow, people don't understand that stuff? Because surely you had to know just talking to people that they didn't know about this stuff.
No, energy can be pretty complex, and most people just turn on the light, start their car. They have no idea where the parts of the car came from, how it was assembled. There's a lot of behind the scenes that people just don't pay attention to. And the way the world is going, it was an opportunity to provide some literacy so they have an understanding of what's going on in the press. And then read about the Green New Deal. Is it good for us or bad for us? Or, we in our two books, we've done a lot of research what's going on around the world. So it's not just the tunnel vision of the California, which represents 0.5% of the world population. The rest of the world is rolling along
Yeah, but we'll talk about it in the context of the world. But one reason I brought you on is because I was reading some of your articles and you had some really good articles about California. And it's always been probably my biggest insecurity about my energy knowledge has been California energy policy, given that I've lived here for 15 years, 16 years. I was learning a lot from reading your stuff. So let me start out with the question that every Uber driver asks me when they learn about what I do for a living, which is why are our gasoline prices so high?
Well, virtually everything we buy is the listed price plus tax. That applies to clothes, computers, cars, except fuel. Our California lawmakers, they're keeping residents blissfully ignorant of the many taxes and regulatory costs that are dumped onto the posted price at the pump. While the governor and the attorney general are getting a lot of press about challenging why Californians continue to pay almost $1 more per gallon than the rest of the country, some of the costs are hidden. They're basically not transparent to the public in that all-in posted price. It may include federal tax, excise tax, sales tax, local sales tax, California's cap and trade, California's low carbon fuel standard, California's renewable fuel standard, and the California refinery winter and summer reformulating costs. That's a lot of taxes and environmental compliance costs that are not transparent to the public. The future looks even bleaker for California because the cap and trade program and the low carbon fuel standard, those programs are just kicking into high gear. And what I mean by that, compliance is getting more and more difficult each year and more costly. Those two government environmental programs, the two alone might add another $1 by 2030 to the price of gasoline.
So how do those work? How exactly do they add price to the gasoline, those two?
It's tougher and tougher to keep reducing the emissions.
Gotcha.
And so a few years ago, back in 2018, I was at a hearing before the State Senate Committee on Business, Profession, and Economic Development because I testified in support of a bill that John Bullock put out. I call it the Transparency Bill. And it would have required gas stations to post near each gas and diesel pump a list of the cost factors to include the federal, state, local taxes, all the costs associated with all the environmental rules and regulations. And the Democratic-controlled committee was adamant. They did not want the public to see those costs. And they killed the bill.
I like that idea. That's a good idea. I mean, it would totally change people's perspective because they would get the causes of it. And because right now it just feels like if you're at the Chevron station in Laguna Beach, it just feels like, oh, it's just Chevron is charging you that. And
right.
that's what they're getting.
Right. Today, we're hearing from the governor and the attorney general, we need an investigation as to why gas prices are so high. When it was their own party that was adamant that they didn't want the public to know those details. Passage of the transparency bill would have remedied the concerns and brought it up front because you could make it twice as expensive for a refinery to make the fuel. They're just going to pass it on to the consumer. And that's not being transparent to the public.
Yeah, I like that idea. I'm sure there are other places where it could be applied as well in terms of transparency. So let's talk about just California in general, because California is this interesting case of we think of ourselves as somehow separate from oil or we're rising above oil. How much oil does California use and what are we using it for?
Well, California, as you know, is the fifth largest economy in the world, and we are an energy hog. With California, Alaska oil production on the decline, California has been importing crude oil from foreign countries to make up the difference. And we imported like 354 million barrels annually. That's a lot of oil, for the refineries to manufacture the usable fuels and petroleum derivatives that make more than 6,000 products that are part of our daily lives. The daily fuel usage, these are big numbers. California has 145 airports, 33 are military, 10 are major, and then there's 100 general. And then they consume like 13 million gallons of aviation fuel every day. That's 1/5 of the nation's jet fuel consumption. California's got 31 million registered vehicles. They're consuming 10 million gallons of diesel and 42 million gallons of gasoline a day. Collectively, between diesel, aviation, and gasoline, that's 65 million gallons of various fuels needed daily to run the California economy. But more importantly than the fuel is, for the transportation infrastructures, is the 6,000 products that come from petroleum derivatives. Those products did not exist before 1900, and they support our current economies. The lifestyles we had before 1900 was hard and dirty. Life expectancy was about 40 years of age. And we live without those products that they're the basis of medication. The basis
so you're talking about products that are made of oil or natural gas, right? That are derived physically, like plastics.
Petroleum derivatives. All medications are made from petroleum derivatives. Electronics, communications, plastic, all forms of transportation. The Tesla is 100% made with petroleum derivatives. You look at
you mean it's involved in all the components. It's got a lot of aluminum in it.
Components. And then we've had almost 200 years to develop clones of generics to replace those products, and we just haven't been able to do it. The social needs of our materialistic society are most likely going to demand more and more products from those chemicals that they get manufactured out of crude oil. And another problem, you want continuous, uninterruptible, and reliable electricity, it'll most likely be from coal, natural gas, or nuclear generation as backup for the windless and sunless days that make wind and solar useless.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that soon. I want to just stay on oil for a minute. So we've talked about oil is so distinctive. I mean, it along with natural gas is the basis of these, what we can call petroleum products or petroleum derivatives, but it's also just this unrivaled fuel for mobility. That's why all the cargo ships are using it, all the planes are using it, just about all the tractors are using it, the agricultural equipment is using it. And you've talked about California as a huge economy is using a huge amount of it. Now, you mentioned something interesting, which is that a lot of it is imported, and that might strike people as odd if they know that the United States has enormous oil production, and even Canada has a lot, although we're having trouble getting it over because of anti-development forces. But why is it that we in California, I guess, where is our oil coming from?
Well,
why is it coming from that?
California is an energy island. We're inhabited by 40 million residents, and we're situated between the Pacific Ocean on one side and the Arizona-Nevada state line on the other side. And there's no pipelines over the Sierra Mountains that run along the eastern border and effectively separates us from the rest of the country.
So the rest of the country is connected pretty well by pipelines?
Yes. And through our dysfunctional energy policies, we're the only state in contiguous America that imports most of our crude oil energy from foreign suppliers to meet the energy demands of the state.
Do you know which are the main suppliers for us?
They're most of them are 10,000 miles away in Saudi Arabia, but all the foreign countries. The other 49 states have implemented exploration efforts that have contributed to America being a net exporter. But our California leaders, it's better to import crude oil instead of increasing in-state crude oil production from the largest shale reserves and ocean reserves known in the Monterey Shale and Pacific Ocean.
Okay, well, let's talk about that because that's important. So, and I've heard different things about Monterey Shale, but essentially, if you look at the U.S. development of oil and gas, it's different, broadly speaking, different kinds of what's called shale. So shale oil, shale gas, and the most prolific basin is the Permian Basin in Texas, but you have some in North Dakota, some in Colorado, other kinds of places, and then in the east you have a lot of natural gas shale deposits, and so California, historically has been a big oil producer, and you mentioned we're declining, Alaska's declining, but you're saying we have a shale deposit of our own that at least has potential. So you could talk about that?
Well, it has potential, but we have a no drilling philosophy here in California. Let me show a graph from the California Energy Commission. This is from the California Energy Commission. The blue is California, You see production has been going down. And the
When does it start? When does it start?
It starts in 1983 and goes to today.
Okay, because I'll bet it goes down even before that. But
yeah, like I say, California production had been going down. Alaska production was expected to go down. And green is the foreign crude oil. Back in 92, back here, we were importing 5% of our oil from foreign countries. But because California and Alaska production has been going down, we've been making up for it with imports from foreign countries. So we imported 5% back in 92. Today, it's 58%. 58% of our crude oil needs are coming in from foreign countries. And, you know, to put that in dollars, it is costing us $60 million every day being paid to oil-rich foreign countries. That's, you know, depriving California of jobs, careers, business opportunities. We've yet to get any thank you cards from the suppliers.
Well,
I
mean, I might have a slightly different perspective of this. I mean, my view is if we didn't have the capability to produce it in California, and if it was cost, so my issue is that we're being restricted in terms of developing the resource here. And I don't know about if it's economic to make pipelines, but presumably if you had all this production in the US and Canada, it would probably be practical to make pipelines one way or another. And what you have in California is obviously this, as you mentioned, this anti-drilling philosophy, more broadly, this anti-human impact policy that says we shouldn't be touching anything, and we shouldn't be drilling for oil. And one reason I wanted to bring you on is that there's just not an awareness in California of how much oil we use and how vital it is to our way of life. And so we don't think about where does it come from. And I think it's shocking to people that, oh yeah, it comes from Saudi Arabia, even though we have the capability to produce it here. And even though the capability exists in the US, because we have this anti-development. So we're not consuming oil. We're just not producing oil. And
we're not producing this. We're just using it's being imported from everywhere else.
And then you just think in terms of opportunity. You think about, I mean, this is certainly a time, I mean, you always have times where people would want the opportunities. Certainly people are happy to take advantage of the opportunities that exist today in the oil and gas industry in California that are very limited. Imagine if we were liberated to actually develop these different places. That would be huge opportunities for people now who are either out of work or have jobs that are less fulfilling and less rewarding. So it seems like a huge opportunity, but that's being just scuttled by the anti-impact people.
Well, the fact that the U.S. is a net oil exporter, all that oil in the Midwest, California has zero access to that. The only way to get that oil to us is to send it through the Panama Canal, and that's too expensive. You could send it by freight, but crude by rail. All those projects that have been attempted have been shut down by environmentalists. So no, we have no access to that. It's pathetic. The interesting thing is a lot of the offshore oil is within 7 miles of the coast. And with current technology, they would do slant drilling. There would be no offshore drilling to access that oil. But like I say, California wants to, reduce our oil, and it's getting worse every day.
Yeah, I mean, it's so tragic, this state, because I still live here. I love living here. It's so nice.
Same here.
And in part, it's so nice that they can get away with so much. And you just think about, offshore drilling, I think is good anyway. Putting up a rig for a couple decades, what's the difference between that and a boat? Boats going around. It's just, but now you can even do it without the visible rig, and it's just this dogma. So one thing you've written about that I want to ask you about is who are the biggest victims of California's oil policies? We mentioned people who could potentially get very rewarding jobs in the industry, but who else is being victimized by this stuff?
Well, to the detriment of those that can least afford expensive fuel for transportation, the practice of dumping more and more cost onto the posted price of the pump is blatantly keeping those costs from being transparent to the public. It's contributed to the poorest residents, particularly Latinos, African Americans, paying $1 more for fuel than the rest of the country. And, if you're making big bucks, say you put 50 or 100 bucks in your gas tank. If you're flipping burgers, you got to say, well, does that 50 bucks go for fuel, pay the rent, pay utilities, put food on the table? It's really tough on those folks. And we profess to be the leader of everything, but spouting voracious pride about the only state that imports most of the oil from foreign countries, and we'll get to this too, and a state that imports more electricity than any other state. That's not in the best interest of the fifth largest economy in the world. And, it's fine to import when you get bargain rates, but both oil and electricity are very expensive commodities to import. And they're ultra expensive, and it drives up the cost of everything. Everything's affected.
Yeah. So I want to talk about electricity in a second. I just would add one thing. So there are these with energy, there's always the direct cost and then the indirect cost, because the direct cost you notice when it's harder to, when it's more expensive to drive somewhere. But then you just think about with oil, where is oil being used to produce things? Because every dollar the price goes higher to produce things, that dollar has to be passed on to you as the consumer. So you just think about oil being involved in agriculture, how that drives up food prices, transportation, that drives up food prices as well, the refrigeration of the things in the trucks. And I think there's a real opportunity for the victims of this to stand up and to say, these green policies are just exploiting us. And there are people who are feeling good about themselves at our expense and the expense of millions of others. Let's jump into electricity. So let's start off with and I know this from personal experience, but how do our electricity prices compare to the rest of the country?
Well, as you may know, California households are already paying 50% more than the national average. Industrial users are paying double the national averages. And businesses and manufacturers, they simply pass that added cost for energy into the products and services they're providing society. And while the state has no plans to replace, we got 4 power plants coming down, 1 nuclear and 3 natural gas power plants.
So nuclear is Diablo's
coming down in a few years.
Because San Onofre already went down, right? That's the one that's pretty near me.
Yes, went down. And there's no plans for replacing it with in-state intermittent electricity from wind and solar. The state's going to need to import more electricity. It's going to be higher priced. And with that, it's just going to be tougher and tougher on residents and businesses paying their premium over the coming years.
Let's talk about the importing, because I don't think this is something that's very well understood. When you hear about a California electricity policy, people just assume, California is going to be powered by X wind and solar. That stuff must be in California and we're self-sufficient, but the grids that we're using are national or at least very large regional grids. So how much of our electricity is coming from other places, and where is it coming from?
Well, we imported 29% of our electricity last year. It's just coming from other states. And, hopefully the other states will have the capacity to generate as much as we're using.
Think about that, 29% of the electricity for factories and homes. It's like all coming. So is that Arizona? Where is it coming from specifically?
Every connecting state we're getting it from. I mean, the grid's well connected.
And where's what's generating their power?
Hydro, some coal, some natural gas. It comes from everything, from some wind and some solar, but that's so unreliable. You really can't depend on that.
Yeah, so I think that's just really important, because I make this point a lot that it's not a viable thing to have unreliables relying on unreliable. So you always have to rely on the reliable somewhere. So if you ever hear something like, we're producing mostly solar and wind, you're not consuming mostly solar and wind. So you're getting it from somewhere. And I don't know if this is true. I was in Utah a while back, and I think it was a Utah coal producer, and he's telling me, I love selling power to California. And there's dynamics like that all over the place, where people are more than happy to sell us power to premium. And if I'm not mistaken, we have really high industrial rates as well, right?
Yes, industrial, they're paying double the national average.
Yeah, that's really important. Often we think too much in terms of residential everything, so residential rates, so we're paying 50% more residentially. And if I think a lot of people are having sticker shock now during COVID because they're using more than their quote, like allotment, and then they really jack up the rates. I don't even know if that's properly represented, because you hear people paying 55 cents a kilowatt hour, which is never quoted in these averages. There's the residential, but the industrial, I mean, that's how we produce things. So what happens to production?
Well, Alex,
if you can't produce things?
When San Onofre went down, we didn't see any change because there was no brownouts. But that was the good news. But the bad news is everybody's bills went up because there was a lot of power that went offline, and it had to come from somewhere. It came from out of state. And
there's no transparent. Is there a transparency about that in the electric bills?
Well, I'm going to be in charge of doing an update of the Orange County infrastructure, and energy is going to be part of it. And I'm going to try and make it more transparent. I'll make sure that Southern California Edison tells the truth about that.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. So just to say one more thing about the industrial, I think this is something that as citizens we should really worry about, because if you just think about so I use the example of like aluminum. So you're using something that uses a lot of electricity like aluminum. If you're an aluminum producer, how much electricity costs is so central to where you'll locate. And we've seen cases, let's say in the UK, where they have these green energy policies, electricity prices skyrocket, and so they just don't produce aluminum there. And so what do? You're still using aluminum, but you're buying it from China, and they are having the business, and they're using the coal to do it. But now you've become less productive. Now the wealthier people in the UK, they're okay with it, but the people who are losing their jobs, or the people who are poorer and are paying premiums, they're the ones getting screwed. And yet the wealthier people are getting status from it, which is very bothersome to me.
You mentioned China. Just for your information, between China and India, they have almost 6,000 power plants powered by coal-fired power plants. And they're building 600 more.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good statistic, because there's this mythology that, China, we better get off fossil fuels because China is the leader in getting off fossil fuels. They're not using solar and wind, and they're definitely the leader of building and commissioning coal plants around the world. And they have a very, I think that government in particular has very much it can be competitive and not the healthiest sense of it, but I think they're all too happy for the US to jack up our electricity prices, for us to have reliability problems. And what are manufacturers going to do? I mean, the reliability is another aspect to this. One thing, I don't know if you've heard anything about this, I'm curious, but I've heard just from behind the scenes people a lot about what I call industrial blackouts. So instead of cutting off power to the consumer, to the residential people, they'll tell a factory, hey, we can't give you power if it's a hot day, or we can't give you power if you just think about you're manufacturing something, and now the weather or these other things are determining, you can't sustain that for long in a global market with unreliable electricity.
Well, to keep the economy going, you need the manufacturers running. If you turn them off, that's going to be a big hit to the economy.
Yeah. So let's see. Who do you think? So we talked about this a little bit, but who are the biggest victims of California's electricity policies?
Again, it's the same thing. To the detriment of those who can at least afford expensive electricity. That lavishly imported electricity is contributing to the poorest residents. Again, it's the Latinos and Africans that are paying, 50% more. It's, the California SB 100, that bill sets us a path toward 100% renewable energy by 2045. That was a second aha moment for me, because, in the motivation for doing my latest book, because renewable energy, all the politicians talk about renewable energy, but renewable energy is only renewable electricity and intermittent electricity at best. Modern life's 100% dependent on fossil fuels, not only for the electricity generation with power civilization, but for land, sea, and air transport, and the manufacture of fertilizers and a host of pharmaceuticals, and indirectly almost every other modern product comes from fossil fuels. Take away fossil fuels, you take away our modern way of life and send us back to subsistence farming. Wind and solar renewables, they've been the primary driver for residents of Germany and Australia. That those two countries now have the highest cost of electricity in the world. And second, and most important, electricity alone is unable to support the militaries, can't support the aviation, can't support the merchant ships and all the transportation infrastructure, nor can electricity make those 6,000 products that are the basis of our lifestyle. In fact, all the parts, electricity came after fossil fuels. And all the parts of wind and solar are made from products that are made from petroleum derivatives.
So, I think it's a really important point you're making because, there's this really false equivalence between energy and electricity. And you see these things just used interchangeably. It's in philosophy, we'd call it an equivocation on energy. So sometimes they'll just say, oh yeah, Germany gets a lot of their energy from solar and wind. And they don't even get the majority of their electricity from solar and wind, but certainly their energy. And the categories that are, I think, most significant are, I think you've hit on all of these, but there's mobility / transportation, the use of liquid fuel for that because it has so much density. Then there's industrial process heat. So much of industry is powered not through electricity, but by directly burning fossil fuels to generate huge amounts of heat because it's much more cost effective. I read there's this really good paper by a guy from JP Morgan recently, and he was talking about hydrogen. Hydrogen is supposedly, it's going to replace fossil fuels. And he was saying that the hydrogen, 95% of the hydrogen is made using fossil fuels, and it's made using industrial process heat from fossil fuels. And he said, if you compare the cost of making it with fossil fuels and the optimistic cost of electricity, it's still 3 times cheaper with fossil fuels. So just think of cement, steel, everything going way up. And then the third one you mentioned is plastics or synthetics. So those 3 categories. Sorry, you were going to say something?
Yeah. Well, you take a look at the medical industry. I mean, all the parts and pieces and plastics. If COVID happened before 1900, we wouldn't be able to handle it because everything you see on TV is made with fossil fuels. Communication equipment. We just put 2 astronauts in space. If you've ever seen the rocket that they get launched on, that thing's about the length of a football field. And if you're able to stand next to it and look up to 33 stories, you're going to get this off the ground and you can get it up to 20,000 miles an hour. And then all the parts, they're all made with fossil fuel derivatives. They're not made with solar panels. They're not made with wind farms. And you're right, there's an analogy that people are making that energy is energy, but it's not. Energy is more than just power.
Well, so one argument for this idea that electricity equals energy is, well, we can just electrify everything. And so one interesting case study of this is EVs in California, and with electric vehicles, or I think it should be BVs, battery vehicles in California. But it's interesting because you're talking about how we're screwing up our grid in California. We're completely non-self-sufficient. We're committed to being much worse. And now we're claiming that we're going to have this mass consumption. We drive all the time. And now we're going to power everything so we need the electricity to power the battery vehicles as well. So first of all, what's just the state of EV use in California right now? Because I think people think it's more dominant than it is.
Well, California has about half all the EVs in the country. The rest of the country doesn't really care about it. We have about half the EVs. And there's 650,000 EVs, and it represents a dismal 2% of the 31 million registered vehicles. California wants more EV cars and more EV trucks. And of course, they'll also be paying no fuel tax to support the funds needed for transport.
Well, I don't think people know that part of it. So you mean like when we pay for fuel, we're paying for roads and stuff and infrastructure. And if you buy an EV, you're not paying for that. Is that the idea?
You're not paying any fuel tax. You're not paying anything to maintain the roads. And, most of the EVs, about 40%, are owned by Gen X, and millennials have like 35% of them. You find most California EVs are in Silicon Valley, Beverly Hills, and Newport Beach. Currently, if you take a look at the world, it's like 1.2 billion vehicles in the world, with projections to grow to like 2 billion, and with some estimates going up to 2.5 billion. But the registration of electric vehicles is projected to only be in the single digits, around 5 to 7%. If the current projections become reality by 2035, 5 to 7% of 2 billion vehicles is going to be 125 million EVs. Now, whatever positives would result, the negative impacts, impossible to ignore, is in fact about 125 billion pounds of lithium-ion batteries need to be disposed of in the decades ahead. The Tesla EV battery is about 1,000 pounds.
Yeah, I think with those, I am concerned about some of the environmental effects of the EVs, but I'm particularly concerned because it's not mentioned. It acts like, well, batteries are health food or something like that, and there's no problems, versus there's all these high toxicity elements that you have to deal with. But I think that most of those, and there's not enough attention paid, as you've talked about, to the foreign labor involved in the human rights abuses, particularly in places like Congo. And I think that needs to be exposed. But I think the main thing is, EVs, there's a lot of nice things about them. I ride an electric skateboard. I love it. It's just a question for me of, when is this the most cost-effective option? And one way to help that be the most cost-effective option, besides not subsidizing it, is not destroy our grid, which is what they're doing. Because it would be great if we have the option, if EVs become really economic, or let's say Elon Musk's, what's it called? The boring company, the underground tunnels, and those can only use EVs for safety reasons. Like, that's all great, as long as we have low cost, reliable electricity on a large scale. But this idea of we're trying to ban oil, and we're making electricity unreliable and unaffordable, and then we're going to all have EVs. It means we're just not going to do anything. So as we're a couple more questions, Ron. So overall, what do you see as the direction of the policy, and what do you think will happen if we continue on this direction?
Well, EVs are hyped as being pollution-free.
And I just mean energy in general, by the way. That was my question. But go ahead with EVs.
Well, yeah, like I say, not necessarily, because true EVs have no tailpipes, but the tailpipes are located at the power plants generating the electricity to charge the batteries, and it's located at the refineries that provide all the derivatives from petroleum that make the parts, and the lithium mines around the world for those 1,000-pound batteries. The range and charging anxieties remain a constant sub-thought for the next buyer. And to fully charge an EV, it takes from 30 minutes to 8 hours, depending on if you're empty or going to fully top it off. Hybrid electric car owners, they're a scholarly bunch. Over 70% of the respondents have a 4-year college degree, and which explains the average household income of the EV buyer is around $200,000. If you're not in that higher educated echelon in high income range society, there may not be an appetite for an EV. In addition, EV interest, as you mentioned, may be impacted negatively as people begin to understand the worldwide environmental degradations and humanity atrocities occurring to mine this stuff worldwide. Those exotic minerals and metals, they're in developing countries that, to support clean energy. They've got no environmental controls, and they got no labor controls. And it's really just tough.
Gotcha. Okay, so I want to just go back to what I was just asking about, which is, so what do you think is going to happen if we continue in this direction as California? What do you see going forward for us? Then we'll talk about how change.
California, we love to view, energy with a tunnel vision. I think California believes we only breathe California air and not the air in the world atmosphere. All we see, what's in front of us is oblivious to the negative impact to the world's emissions and environmental degradation that's resulting from importing oil from foreign countries that have less environmental controls than us, than producing it in state. And then you talk about the future. Newman, he wants to
Newsom or Newman?
Our famous governor.
Oh, Newsom. Yeah, Newman is the villain on Seinfeld, although I have similar feelings about.
No, our governor, he wants to further decrease our in-state production by setting setbacks to existing wells. And if he does that, I mentioned we're spending like $60 million a day to import oil from foreign countries. That would probably increase to $80 million a day. If you reduce California production further, you have to make up for it somewhere. It's going to come from foreign countries. So, it's interesting that California believes that we represent 0.5% of the world population. But the oil and gas industry is not a California business with a couple refineries. It's an international industry. There's 700 refineries worldwide that are making fuels and making the derivatives for the products. In pursuit of going green at any cost, like Germany's failed program. Germany was the first country to go green. It's been a total disaster. They have the highest cost of electricity in the world. And their emissions have gone up. Hasn't done a thing. And California is following right behind them. And we're going to decrease our in-state crude oil production. We're going to decrease our in-state electrical generation by shutting down these power plants. And the state's dependency on foreign countries for crude oil and dependency on other states for electricity, it's accelerating.
So what should we be doing? What do you advocate?
Well, first of all, become more energy literate. I believe what California is going to do, read your book, More Case for Fossil Fuels. I've got 2 books. The first book is a 5-star rated book, Energy Made Easy. Read that one. The latest book, and again, I told that was my second aha moment, Just Green Electricity. But the subtitle is Helping Citizens Understand a World Without Fossil Fuels. And Alex, it ain't pretty. We go back to the 1900s. They had no fossil fuels in 1900. And it all changed then. I know it explains, your book and my 2 books explains it all in a clear, concise. They're all well-researched, documented, and it will show the public the ramifications of a world without fossil fuels and the products that we get from that we enjoy. Then, if they're happy with the California energy policies that impose some of the highest costs in the country for electricity and fuels, they keep electing the same candidates. If they decide the California energy policies are dysfunctional, like I have, and not in the best interest of the 40 million residents, especially the poor, then send a message by electing different leaders that may have some energy literacy, that are cognizant of the negative impacts to the world economy. Look outside. If we're importing it, it's coming from somewhere. And, what's the impact on the world economy and the increased emissions by relying on countries with less environmental controls in California, to meet the energy demands of the state.
So then I would say as an implication of that, one thing would be liberate oil and gas drilling in California. So allow that again, and then start building reliable power plants again.
Well, yes, because if you think about it, the oil and gas industry is not a needed industry. It's only needed because we have demand for it. If we didn't demand the products, we wouldn't need the refineries to make it for us, because they're not making it for their own good. They're making it to meet our needs. So we have to change our lifestyle. We've become more fuel efficient. My son mentioned airplanes are much more fuel efficient than they were in the past. I said, that's the good news. The bad news is more planes. So you're not gaining.
Well, that's good. I think that's all good news. So we become more efficient to do more. We don't become more efficient to do less.
Right. But the tough thing in developing countries, because, developing countries, they're experiencing 11 million kids dying every year from malnutrition, starvation, diarrhea, diphtheria, all from preventable diseases. But they don't have the medical stuff that we have here. And it's like I say, if people are happy with, us going back to that kind of working environment, I mean, those people haven't even joined the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, I don't think most people would be happy if they understand that the level of life that we have, compared to the level of life in the undeveloped world. So,
well,
Ron,
COVID-19 was kind of like a semi-prelude to life without fossil fuels. Because life without fossil fuels, you would have no airlines. It would pretty much shut down the airports. You'd have no transportation, automobile transportation. And by choice, we're locked in our house and not traveling much, and the freeways are empty. The one big caveat, the one change is we may not have the transportation. The cruise liners aren't running, the airplanes aren't flying, and most people aren't driving their vehicles much anymore, is we have the benefit of those 6,000 products that is supplying the medical industry, supplying the communication, electronic industry. We wouldn't be able to work virtually if we didn't have all the electronics and the Wi-Fi's and et cetera, et cetera. All those are derivatives from the fossil fuels. Now, if we go back before 1900, you get rid of all that stuff too. Turn in your iPad, and turn in your television and everything else. So everything changed in 1900. That's when we developed the automobile, the airplane, and we were using coal to run trains before that. But that's when 1900 is when we really started developing uses of petroleum and using the derivatives to make all kinds of products. And that led us into the Industrial Revolution. That was instrumental in why we won 2 world wars and how we have a space program.
Yeah, I mean, mobility revolution and materials revolution, those are both amazing. And I think when people think about mobility, I mean, we're experiencing directly our lack of mobility and how negative that is. But you also have to think about the mobility of materials, the mobility of products, and how much that benefits your life, and things like food going up in price. And so I think one thing that's really important is just that we take this experience of COVID and draw the right lessons from it, because of course there are people saying, oh, well, we need to do more of this. We need a green reset. So we've had these fantastic losses of emissions, and let's figure out how to keep that going. It's like, well, but that's related to life being bad. So we don't want to keep it going.
Right.
So Ron, got to wrap up, but any final messages that you want to share with our audience, or anything else you want to recommend them to? You recommended your 2 books, but any other final messages?
My 2 books in your book, because I think if they're energy literate, they'll be able to understand if there's the good side or the bad side of the Green New Deal and what is being proposed, because there's good and bad with everything we do. And I just see the confusion. First of all, the aha moment for most citizens is renewable energy is not renewable energy. They got to comprehend that is renewable electricity.
Well, it's not renewable, and it's not really electricity.
That's true. But again, it's only electricity. And,
but it's not electricity. Electricity is reliable.
We want it to be reliable. And,
electricity we want it to be reliable, but it's important. It's like, it doesn't produce electricity. I mean, it can supplement electricity. It can be a parasite, but it doesn't, like solar and wind, they don't produce what we know as electricity. Like, they produce maybe what, a poor part of Indonesia knows as electricity, which is sometimes is on, sometimes is off.
But now I would recommend that people become more energy literate and be able to comprehend what's being talked about in the press. And because I think our politicians are basically lacking energy literacy, or I think they would know some of the stuff they're proposing is not in the best interest of humanity.
Definitely. And also, like your point about energy transparency, and we definitely need more literacy and transparency in California. So Ron, thanks a lot for joining me.
Alex, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks again to Ron Stein for joining me. One point that I was thinking of that I didn't really fit in as we were talking is there's this issue of the materials that we get from fossil fuels, or more accurately, it's materials we get from hydrocarbons, which that's That's the more technical term for the raw material that goes into fossil fuels. So coal, oil, and gas, you can think of as solid, liquid, and gaseous hydrocarbons. So combinations of hydrogen and carbon that are derived from ancient dead life, primarily plants and plankton, those little microorganisms. Anyway, I think it's important that it's very valuable to know that so many of the amazing materials in our world are derived from oil and natural gas. But I think it's important that the people arguing against fossil fuels aren't necessarily arguing against these synthetic materials. So when they say, we're against oil, there's a coherent position that says, well, we're against burning oil, but in fact, we want to use oil for synthetic products. And actually, you'll get engineers who will say, well, actually, we don't want to burn oil and we want to use it only for synthetic products because it's so good for those products. Now, most people against fossil fuels for burning have an opposition to synthetics as well. And I think it's because there's this deeper opposition to human impact on the earth. So if you're against burning things and you only focus on, we're impacting things too much, and that's the whole frame you look at things through, then you're going to probably think the same thing about plastics. But there is nevertheless, when we're dealing with the moral case against fossil fuels, there's a version of it that can be pro-plastic and that can be pro-using quote unquote fossil fuels for materials. So I just think it's important to separate those issues. And it's part of why sometimes I get criticized by people in oil and gas for not talking enough about synthetics, because synthetics are really cool. And it's good for people to know that there are a lot of benefits from using them. And that's connected to oil and gas, things that they think of as bad. But the core issue is really, what do we use for energy? Is it okay that we're using this for energy? Is it good? Is it bad? And so that's why I focus on that issue primarily, because that's the real question at issue. Okay, next up, let me address 2 listener questions. And so these are accelerator questions, which means these are people who generously contributed $250 to our accelerator program. And just as a reminder or an introduction, this is a program where people who believe in the mission of my work and the work of the Center for Industrial Progress can help accelerate that work by giving money that goes directly toward either our research and development efforts or our promotional efforts. This doesn't go to me, doesn't sustain me or anything like that, but it helps me do more. So it helps me bring on smart people to help with the moral case for fossil fuels 2.0. It helps me promote good videos. It's helping me with a political project that I will definitely be talking about on this show next week. So it really is helpful. And right now we're in a crucial election year. Energy is going to be a huge issue. It's starting to become a huge issue. These accelerator contributions help me make a big impact. And to date, I've been offering, well, if you give $250, the reward at that level is you get to ask a question and I'll answer it on Power Hour. I am almost certainly going to stop doing this starting in August, just because I got a lot of other stuff to do. So if you want to get in a guaranteed question, then you can give your accelerator contribution before August. I don't mean to do takeaway selling. That just happens to be my plan, just because I need to focus all of my efforts on just a few core things in these very vital few months. But these are some good questions, so I'm glad to have them. The first question is from William, and it's kind of a cute, has some tongue-in-cheek elements, but I thought he raised some interesting issues. So this is from William, and he says, privilege is the hot term of our culture. We are told, quote, you should feel guilty for your such and such privilege, unquote. What about energy privilege? Is a hot shower the best place to contemplate one's energy privilege? Out of solidarity with those who do not have energy privilege, should I wash my clothes by hand, read by candlelight, and cook my food on animal dung? Is it true that energy privilege is the greatest determinant of an individual's ability to flourish? Is typing negative slogans about fossil fuels on my MacBook Pro with the AC on the best way to signal my energy privilege? Please answer these questions and renounce or celebrate your energy privilege in your podcast. Thank you, Will, unabashed beneficiary of energy privilege. So I don't think he means for me to answer all of his questions literally, because some of them are somewhat rhetorical, but I think it's an interesting, this use of privilege is an interesting thing in the culture. And, sometimes there's, I think, two senses in which you can use privilege, or probably more than two, but two that come to mind for me. So some is where you are like unfairly elevated, where you are benefiting at others' expense. So that's, so if you think about, I think that criticism of America today, that's a more complex issue. But if you just think of like an obvious kind of racist society, or, some, society that has a caste system or any kind of system where very specifically, if you look like this or you come from this bloodline, you get these things, and often other people are forced to provide them. That's a kind of privileged situation. But there are other privileged situations, and I think this largely describes what is sometimes called white privilege. And that's a whole interesting issue in and of itself, that discussion. But it's often described as, well, you have a privilege because you're not being persecuted in ways that people of other races are. And so if you take that as, well, at least on some occasions, individuals, Black individuals, for example, like are getting mistreated, let's say by police in certain situations. And I don't want to go into all the demographics of this, but let's just say, this happens, and there are certain contexts in which it happens more, at least certain places in which I'm sure it happens more. You can think of it as, is it right to call it a privilege that the person who's not suffering that injustice? Well, that's really just the right thing. So in that case, what you'd want is you want everyone to have this quote unquote privilege. And it doesn't really make sense to call it a privilege, except that it has an emphasis of, this is a thing that is unusual, that not everybody has. And this is why I kind of like this term energy privilege, because it's not that one person having energy comes at the expense of another, but there is something very special about having reliable, low-cost energy that definitely people today in general have, that people 200 years ago, let alone more than 200 years ago, didn't have. So there's something really, and it can be good to appreciate it. And then particularly to appreciate, as Will's question indicates, that there are billions of people who do not have reliable, low-cost energy and the benefits of that. So in that context of appreciating how amazing it is to have reliable, low-cost energy, I thought I would talk a little bit about how to appreciate that and some details of why it's such a, quote, privilege. So just in terms of appreciating it, it's really hard to remember if you live in what I call the empowered world. So I call it the empowered world because I'm emphasizing the role of energy. So this is a role in which we have machine power. Any goal that we have, we can bring a lot of machines to bear to achieve that goal. And one fundamental aspect of that is that allows us to overcome the basic nature of nature, which is that nature gives us a planet not that is safe and sufficient, let alone abundant, but it gives us a planet that's dangerous and deficient. And basically, if we don't have machines, so if we have to do manual labor versus machine labor, we just don't have enough physical power to do all that much productive work. And so we cannot produce enough value to neutralize all the different dangers of nature, building sturdy homes and clothing and whatnot, and not enough to produce the sustenance that we need, the food and the healthy drinking water that we need. And so machines just dramatically amplify our productive ability. And I think it's just important to remember that we're still in a world where billions of people don't really have machine power, and they have a very natural and suboptimal level of productivity. And so I was reading recently an example, and this is from Bjorn Lomborg. I forget what publication of his it was. It's not in his latest book, although he has some stuff like this, but he's just telling some stories of people. And so this is somebody in Zambia, not to be confused with the Gambia, which is a place that I talk about in the Moral Case for Fossils, but they're both in Africa, and they're both very poor places. So it's just a description of a woman named Florence. And I would just think of this in the context of, this is somebody who does not have energy privilege. This is somebody who is not empowered. And here are just some excerpts. As a widow, Florence is the sole income provider for 5 children and a grandchild. Okay. So that sometimes happens. in the empowered world. But then she scrapes together just, and I think the number is $38 each month by selling ground nuts and vegetables at a desk outside her house and renting out one of its 2 rooms. Okay, so just think $38 each month. So that's, $1 and change a day selling ground nuts and vegetables. Then her family of 7 crams into one room. There is no running water and no toilet. And if I remember correctly from this story, I don't have the quote in front of me, the room is about 10 by 10. So you just think about a 10-foot by 10-foot room with 7 people. So it's her, 5 children, and a grandchild, and that's in one room. Then she says, I have great problems feeding my children. I can only afford to buy 1 bag of mealy meal a month. That's corn flour used for basic meals. So we only eat 1 meal a day to have enough for the whole month. Then it says Florence's children often get sick and she cannot afford medical care. I just pray to God that they will get well. And then here's a general quote from Lomborg. According to UNICEF, half of Zambia's children under the age of 5 are affected by undernutrition. Anemia and vitamin A deficiency are widespread. A lack of iron causes physical and mental impairment. On average, a person with iron deficiency is 17% weaker and loses 15 IQ points. Vitamin A deficiency causes blindness and diminishes the ability to fight infection, unquote. So I want to just situate all of this as this is what happens when people have very low productive ability. And an essential of them having low productive ability is they don't have machine power. And what fossil fuels give us is they give us low cost energy, which gives us low cost machine power. And I want to elaborate on this. I think there are 3 senses in which 3 main ways in which fossil fuels are really any form of energy, but fossil fuels are the only form of energy that can give low-cost energy to billions of people for the foreseeable future, certainly with all the different kinds of energy, including transportation energy / mobile energy, and then what's called industrial process heat, like making steel and making cement and whatnot. So if you look at fossil fuels or low-cost energy, as long as you recognize that's only fossil fuels can give it to us, you think about how does this amplify our productive ability? How does that get us out of a situation like the situation Florence is in? So one is, when we're thinking about energy, one is we use energy to power all the machines we use to accomplish our goals. So if we think about just in our productive life, if you are, let's say you do work on a computer, then you're using energy directly in the computer. And then if you have a more, let's say you're working at a pharmaceutical factory, then you might think, okay, well, I get the pharmaceutical factory has all of these different machines. So you can just think of the machines that directly produce the product or service that you are part of. And then in your life as a consumer, you can see, well, what are all the machines I use at home? So that's the most direct thing. And so I think it's very valuable to just look in the world and to see, here are all the ways in which I am using machines, and to just recognize all of those machines require energy, i.e., that is machine food. And so we can think about, well, the lower cost the machine food is, the lower cost it is to operate the machines. So that's the most basic level. And even that's the level we're not taught to think about, just to think about wherever there are machines, there's energy. But then the second one is, so there's powering all the machines we use directly. But then there's powering all the machines that we use indirectly. And by that, I mean the machines that produce every material value we use. So if I just think about, okay, I'm in a condo right now. Now that has machines in it, it has heating and air conditioning and that kind of thing. It has lights here, but then machines were needed to make the condo, to assemble the condo. And then all the materials in the condo were made by machines, or they're different kind of intermediate materials. Let's say there are wood panels, those are manufactured by machines and those use energy. And then the logging took energy. So every material value we use is produced by one machine, but really many machines. So you just think about, well, that energy, that machine food, that's used in the production of everything we do. And so the more energy we can use, the more machines we can use, the more we can produce everything effectively, because we can use instead of using manual labor to do the logging and, cutting down the trees with a saw, we can use a chainsaw or something even better than that in terms of, instead of transporting them by walking, we can use a diesel truck. And instead of building the building by hand, we can use machines. So every stage of production involves machines. And then because that makes human beings far more productive than if they use manual labor. And so you can start to get why we're so productive, because we can bring machines to bear on every little task. And we can keep amplifying the amount of work that one person can do by giving them machines. So that's the second sense. So energy powers all the machines we use directly, but it also powers all the machines we use indirectly. And so that's every material value we use is produced by machines, including the machines themselves. So, your air conditioner, that itself is produced by machines in all sorts of ways. And the third way in which, we're using energy and benefiting from energy, and this is maybe the least obvious, is in the freeing up of time, the freeing up of time. And this is something I've been talking about more recently. So if you think about a human being to survive, to just continue, we need a certain amount of food for our bodies. Food and water, those are the very basic things that we need. And what machines do is they allow us to produce either directly or indirectly. If we're trading with someone, we can produce the basic necessities of our survival much, much more quickly, which means that we free up time to produce other things. Where if you take somebody who's on a subsistence farm, they're spending almost all of their time just getting to the next day. So they have no ability or very little ability to specialize in anything else. And the more machine power you have in the society, the more quickly you can meet the most basic needs and the more time you free up for everything else. And you can think of that from the perspective of you free up leisure time, but also you free up more productive time. And most of our jobs today, almost all of our jobs today, are made possible by the amount of machine power that exists. But it's not just that I can think of, I'm a writer, I'm using machines to write, but it's so much of the ability to be a writer and to have it be valuable that, hey, here's somebody who advises us on energy policy. That's valuable. Well, that's only possible because there are these amazing machines that we can use at very low cost to produce the basics of life. So that's freeing up time. And so what you see is that this woman, Florence in Zambia, and many other people around the world, they don't have this. They don't have machines to produce things directly. They're not using machines in their productive work very much. There's not much machine power going into all the different inputs of their productive work. And as a result, there's not much time freed up. So there's this, I sometimes will think of it as this vicious circle of unempowerment where you just can't produce very much over your basic survival level. And so you just get stuck in that. And it's this vicious circle. Whereas once you get empowered, it's really cool because then you can take care of your basic survival really quickly. And then you can, then you free up time to do more. And part of what you free up time to do is to innovate. And so then you can come up with better ways of producing energy or more efficient, effective types of machines. And that's a lot of how progress goes forward as we free up time. And then we can think about ways to become even more productive. And then that frees up more time. Then we can think of ways to become even more productive. And that's part of why we have accelerating progress in the empowered world. So that is really a privilege to be able to produce energy reliably at a very low cost, because it is just dramatically amplifying our productive ability by giving us machine power directly and indirectly, and then freeing up all of this time. So that's how I think of my energy privilege. Hope that was useful. Will. Okay. Next question from Farhana. We went back and forth. She was asking earlier about some of the lockdown stuff, but then I ended up answering that and dealing with that stuff anyway. But she raised an interesting issue. She says, the lockdowns were an example where rule of law broke down in an emergency. Instead, governors were able to exert control over large swaths of the population. How about discussing the effect that cheap and plentiful energy has on diminishing the power of tyrants? I was thinking about the different movements such as the Hong Kong uprising and some other movements such as the one in Tunisia, Egypt, and places in the Mideast circa 2010, 2011. To a large extent, these have been organized using social media, which ultimately is due to the availability of electricity and devices on the internet. The backbone of the internet is powered by the availability of energy in other more free countries. At face value, it seems the response and participation in Hong Kong is greater than in the other countries. A large part of that is the organizing activities happening using the internet. I would think Hong Kong has access to cheaper and more electricity than the Arab nations. It still remains to be seen what's going to happen in Hong Kong. The Arab movements did not lead to lasting change, but at least it gave parts of the population a voice. We've also seen the protests over the lockdown here that may have led to governors backing down. These have also been organized using similar tools. Just wondering if you consider this angle. What do you think? So I think there's some really interesting issues raised here. Let me just start off with what I talked about in the last question, which is just a relationship between energy and machine power. So energy is machine food. It's what our machines eat to operate, just as we need to eat food to operate. They need food/calories to operate. The lower cost energy is the lower cost machine power is, because the lower cost energy is the lower cost it is to operate any given machine, but also to produce every machine, because every machine basically is produced by other machines. So the lower cost the machine food is, the lower cost every machine is, everything produced by a machine is, and so everything in life gets to be lower cost, which means you can do more, you can achieve more in less time, and you can do certain things that we just couldn't do at all with manual labor, like run an internet. So in this context, the types of machines we're talking about are communications machines. And communications machines are having enormous impacts on our lives. I think there are impacts that there are many misgivings about. And my current thinking on it is they're having enormous impacts on our lives that obviously have many benefits so far. I think a bunch of hazards, but I think in the long term, they will be incredibly beneficial. And so I want to start off with the positive. And one is definitely the power to expose injustice. I mean, the more you have communications machines, the more you can do things like, I mean, literally shine light on things, like literally. And then you can film them, you can talk about them, you can reach people around the world. And it's very possible that just the existence of communication today in a world with any amount of machine power, at least those parts of the world, it's much easier, it's much harder to ignore atrocities. And so I wouldn't be at all surprised if, as communication increases, the number and scale of at least the most obvious kinds of atrocities would be limited. I mean, you just think of something like the Holocaust. If they had all had iPhones back then, would it have gone down that way? It's not to say that there aren't really bad things that can still happen, but would that really have happened with people seeing that? I mean, certainly a lot of the lies would have been harder to expose. So I think communications machines definitely give us the power to expose injustice. And another thing they give us is they generate more awareness of better ways of life. So you just think about, people are aware. Now, all these things can be distorted, but nevertheless, you can see a movie from the United States. And there are all kinds of people who hear all sorts of propaganda about the US. Let's say you're born in Iran and you're hearing lots of propaganda, but you can still see elements of what happens in the US, and you can say, well, I want this. And you have people who often very courageously will immigrate from somewhere like Iran and try to come over, and hopefully successfully come over if they really want to live in America and benefit from America and the freedom here. And you just think like that was an exposure that's much more possible with communications machines versus just, oh, you hear things. Now you could hear something true, but the fact that it's much more powerful if you can actually see it. So I see these two as huge positive forces, that we can expose injustice with communication machines, and we can we can sort of expose positives or generate awareness of better ways of life. But let's talk about the hazards of this. And I think one hazard, and this is something that I don't really agree with almost anyone who talks about it, because I think there are two wrong ways of going at it, but is that right now, like communications machines, including the communications software, are incredibly centralized, and they are controlled by something approaching, I mean, this is a little bit too harsh, but anti-American statists. So that's too harsh, but it's not completely untrue. And there's a substantial amount of truth. I don't have the term I'm looking for before I explain the rest of that is like, there are definitely people who think that the government needs to exercise a lot more coercive control over human life, and that dramatic changes to the American system are needed, usually in the direction of more government control. So it's not to say the American system needs to be overhauled to be more like its essence in terms of its founding principles. That's not usually the thing. It's usually there needs to be more control. And often this is lumped together, I think, falsely with science. That is, we need to control, and we need scientists to just determine everything and to, in effect, dictate people's lives. But this is often described in terms of left and right, which I think are very problematic. But nevertheless, there is a certain kind of establishment viewpoint that is clearly held by fill in the blank, Facebook, the leadership of Facebook, Twitter, Google, just to take those three. And those platforms are, so there's this movement of, oh, the government should control these platforms. It's hugely problematic. And these platforms are private property. And I think but part of what I think the people who say, well, they're private property, they can do what they want, I think that's true. But I think we have to recognize that people have, I think, been very deceived. And whose fault that is an interesting question. But I think they've been fundamentally deceived about the nature of these platforms, because these platforms were pitched as or thought of as a social network. So it's basically a network where, decentralized social network where you communicate. There are some basic rules, but essentially you can associate with the people you want to associate with, and you can disassociate with the people you want to disassociate with, but you can communicate with people. And if people are interested in your views, they can hear them. And this is clearly not what these platforms see themselves as. I mean, maybe Facebook to some extent, but I think of them not as social networks, but as cultural influence platforms in a very substantial way. That is, the founders of them are in very important ways think it is our job to influence the culture. Like, that's what we want to do. We want to make the world a better place. And so what we're going to do is we are going to significantly control what people see on this platform. So it's not going to be nearly as much what they choose. We're going to choose for them, or we're going to restrict choices that they would make. And I think you can certainly see this with COVID-19. And I think a very scary example that I think everyone, regardless of how what your views are on the severity of the virus and the severity of the virus to different people and what the politics are, I think if you look at the handling of this current hot topic of hydroxychloroquine, I find this terrifying in terms of what these platforms are doing. So, and I don't want to go too much into this because this is, I don't know if Farhana wants me to address this, but it's, I'll having answered the core question, I want to just talk about this so I have no expertise at all on hydroxychloroquine, but what I noticed pretty early on was there were certain people making claims about hydroxychloroquine who were claiming really good results, who were advocating it. And they were basically saying, like, give a safe dose of this at the early onset of symptoms. Like, that was their view. And if you look at just the reporting on it, it's crazy, because it just constantly gets people say, like, oh, well, we gave hydroxychloroquine in massive doses at the very end and it didn't work, and therefore hydroxychloroquine is bunk. And you just see this is being published as, oh, this is knowledge, and everyone is being called a crank who advocates it. Okay, so that's one thing. But then what happened definitively, and this is now admitted by Wikipedia, is now admitted by everybody, is that there was a study, so-called study published by The Lancet, which is, as far as I know, the most prestigious medical journal in the world, on hydroxychloroquine that was just fraudulent to a degree that is almost unimaginable. It involved this firm called Surgisphere that just, as far as we can know, like, completely manufactured findings. And yet those findings led to immediate action by the World Health Organization condemning hydroxychloroquine, FDA condemning hydroxychloroquine. And then some of the people who were being demonized as cranks exposed this. The Lancet it's a scandal. If you look at, this is not like Trump's view or not anything like that. This is like, if you look up Science Magazine or any of these things, look up Wikipedia, this is just a complete scandal that of course barely gets reported compared to the original findings. So people think, oh, hydroxychloroquine is bad. And it's to the point where it's being heavily restricted by governments, where doctors who very strongly believe in it as an early stage safe treatment that could have really positive preventative aspects are really not permitted to prescribe it or are being punished for it. And what you see is just the current knowledge system that's so dominated by these few platforms. They're just completely dogmatic in terms of promoting what the WHO says or what the FDA says. But then this is the key point, is suppressing opposing views. So what you had is a couple days ago, in the last few days, you had a group of doctors, I think they were called America's Frontline Doctors. And these are practicing physicians, as far as I can tell, most of them, very respected and successful. And they believe that hydroxychloroquine is, their main argument is this is very safe. It's safer than aspirin if you give it in the right dose. A lot of the criticisms are based on like very high, too high doses. And there's very significant evidence they believe that it could be effective. So that is certainly the kind of view that you would think could be shared on a social network by anybody, let alone respected doctors. But they got something like 14 million views, and they got shut down by Facebook. I forget what happened on Twitter, but definitely by YouTube. And then Squarespace, which hosted their site, shut them down for violation of policy. So these are people expressing an opinion. These are doctors expressing an opinion about a medication. And keep in mind, this is a medication that was fraudulently lied about by the leading medical journal, the leading World Health Organization, the US FDA. They all participated in a complete fraud about this. And yet the platforms are still perpetrating that. They still they still have like the interview with the head of Surgisphere last time I checked, like announcing these things. They're still promoting it. And yet they're suppressing dissent. So technically this is not censorship because it is their platform, but this is a complete suppression of intellectual debate, and discourse in a really terrifying way, because it leads to these unchallenged propaganda machines instead of open discussion. And these platforms are just so, I don't know all the reasons why, but they're just so lockstep on, if there is some governmental organization, we are going to suppress any views that dissent with it. And in fact, the CEO of YouTube said more or less this exactly. We're going to suppress things that contradict what the World Health Organization said. Now, the World Health Organization published over a 3% death rate from COVID, which is just completely false. They published that. They also said masks are completely unnecessary and masks are completely necessary. So which one of those should get suppressed? They published this completely, or they promoted and gave guidance on this completely fraudulent study of hydroxychloroquine. And yet so it's very problematic in general for these platforms to be suppressing things. That you really have to have a policy, like, what you're doing, but they're totally becoming a mouthpiece of these completely, I wouldn't say incompetent, but very corruptible and problematic government organizations. In general, just professional societies have all sorts of issues of politics. If you've ever been involved in any of them, they're just so political. It's not the kind of thing you want to give a monopoly. And yet you just see the scary thing is in lockstep, they're suppressing people that they're saying, oh, they're having the wrong view. It's not the scientific view. Meanwhile, the scientific authorities have supposedly scientific, have repeatedly contradicted themselves and participated in demonstrable fraud. And that's not considered a problem. So I think that this is a real hazard of the current state of communications machines and networks. And what it's going to really require, I think, is new platforms for us to learn, really, and to have new platforms that have much less restriction and much more of a clear policy, not where they can just say, oh, well, anything we want, we can take down. And so you violated our our terms of service. I think that is, and it's one of these things where technology you can think of as a fundamentally good source. I forget the word is escaping, but it's a source of good mostly and over time, but it's ultimately something that gives us more capability. And those capabilities can be used for bad things, including to suppress discussion. So I think the current centralized, very much like statist, we can at least call them establishment, social pseudo networks and really cultural influence platforms, that is a really big problem. And I would caution against saying the solution is, the government should control this, nor would I suggest taking the position I've seen some other people take, maybe I'm caricaturing it, but which is, oh yeah, well, it's their platform, they can do whatever we want, and we don't have to be, it's not really censorship, so we don't have to be bothered by it. No, we have to really be bothered by it and start voting with our time to do, and our money to do other things. So that was a lot on that, Farhana. I hope that you found that useful, at least the first half of that. And I'm glad I got this aspect of the COVID situation off my chest, because I believe so much in the freedom to engage in intellectual discourse. And when you have these kinds of monopolies, and it just lowers the quality of everything. And you can see when these monopolies exist, they do not give you careful explanations of anything, and nor do they give you careful explanations of the wrong views. They say a lot of wrong things, end up giving a lot of wrong guidance, in addition to, I'm sure, a lot of right guidance, and there's no real apology process. So definitely need a change there. So that's, but I should still say, overall, it's really good that we have these communications machines, these machines in general, but in particular, these communications machines. There's a lot of good they can do, but that good is not automatic. So there's a lot we have to do as ultimately the people running these and controlling them and writing the software, controlling the software. We have to do a better job at using them. All right. That probably made that this Power Hour a little bit longer than an hour, maybe a lot longer than an hour. I'll have to check the time, but hope you enjoyed it. As always, if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, email me at alex@alexepstein.com. Let's see what else. If you can follow me on social media, but most important thing is, if you want weekly updates as well as the free energy clarity course, go to industrialprogress.com and sign up for the newsletter. Hope I've been getting a lot of good feedback on the shows lately. I know a lot of you like me having guests. If you have any suggested guests, again, feel free to email me. I have some in mind for the next couple weeks. Hopefully I'll be able to get them on. And there's lots of interesting stuff to talk about. And next week, I will be sharing with you some new talking points that I've created for this energy election that you can use and also share with candidates. Also, finally, I mentioned this earlier, but if you want to support our research and development and promotional efforts, you can become an accelerator at industrialprogress.com/accelerator. All right, that is it for this week. I'll be back next week. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.